Hi, today we're going to be looking at this source exam. Using these four sources in their historical context, assess how far they support the view that factory reform was successful. Now notice the first bit in red, that is because these questions will always start on that exact same way, and then you've got a question tail. Factory reform was successful. I've color-coded success in purple because that's a particularly important word to be thinking about, because success can be measured in many different ways. Before we get on to that, we're going to start with an activity just to try and prep your factual recall. So pause the video and try and get as many of these questions as possible. There's 30 marks in total, going from really easy to perhaps much harder. I'd say if you're getting 15 out of 30, that's a really good place to start. So here's all of the answers. I would say you could probably find a way to mention absolutely every single bit of knowledge using the four sources we're going to be looking at. But having said that, there's no way you'd ever be able to use all of them in time conditions. So like I said, 15 out of 30 is a good place to be getting on with. When you go to annotate the sources, pause this video and come back to this specific section so that you can try and add as much own knowledge as possible. Think, oh, where could I use that for this source or this source? So going back to the question, using these four sources in their historical context, assess how far they support the view that factory reform was successful. So we're going to start off with some simple instructions on how to answer any question, and then we'll start looking at the sources in depth. So obviously you need to read the sources carefully. Some teachers actually recommend you read the sources before you even read the question. I think that's a little bit too far. The most important point is, do you understand exactly what the question is asking? So obviously this is about factory reform. We've been looking at topic 6, which includes mines reforms, or the 1842 Mines Act. That's not asked in this question, so you shouldn't really try to talk about it unless you're putting it in the context of wider social reforms. And like I said before, we've got that purple success. So again, I'd like you to pause the video and think, how would you gauge, how would you measure whether or not factory reform would be successful in this period? So I've got a couple of ideas that previous classes have come up with. I think the first one is the most important. Did it achieve the aims of its creators and its supporters? And are there possible disagreements between the two? Obviously, the 1833 Factory Act is passed by the Whigs, the 1844 Factory Act is passed by the Conservatives, but within both of those, there are supporters that want those acts to go much further. In particular, Osler and Lord Ashley and the champions of the 10-hour movement, they do not get their aim of a 10-hour working day for all people until 1853 and that Factory Act. So if you're going to use the criteria of whether or not the supporters judge it a success, then most of them are going to be thinking it's fine, it's a good measure, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not exactly what we're looking for. Particularly for the 1833 and 1844 Factory Acts, you can think about whether or not these laws are actually being followed and respected. And again, that's both by the employers and the employees. So a lot of the time, families will still send their young children into these factories because they need the money. So even though these acts are being used to protect those children, many often times those children are still being sent there by their parents. Is it popular? Is it an important step in the right direction? Now, for any of these source exam questions, you've got three main paragraphs. No introduction is needed. Your first paragraph, the very first sentence, should explain all of the sources which agree with the view. The second paragraph should talk about all the sources which disagree with the view. And in the conclusion, you need to look at each of those sources in turn and assess how far and how strongly they support the view. So we've got these next four slides, which will just have each of these sources on them in case you haven't got a physical copy in front of you. So again, pause the video, don't go on to the bit where I start talking about my own annotations. Make sure you do as much of this as possible. I'd strongly recommend having a physical copy in front of you, and then again having two different color highlighters. Highlight any key phrases which agree with the view, and highlight any key phrases in a different color for anything which disagrees with the view. Okay, so we're going to go run through most of the comments which you might want to be using. I've used different color coding schemes here, so the bolded bits are the ones which I'd strongly recommend you use. The underlined bits are comments which we might be using in these examples, or just extra things if you want to try and go for a higher mark. So very broadly, source A is the strongest supporter, source D is the strongest opposer, and sources B and C are a bit of both. The exam board will always make sure that two sources agree, and they'll always make sure that two sources disagree, but they'll almost definitely make sure that there'll be three sources which agree and three sources which disagree. I think source B is probably the hardest one to find examples of both, but it is there if you look hard enough. So, looking at source A, he's a Scottish doctor and chemist, a man by the name of Andrew who is a specialist in manufacturing conditions. Now, your source paper might go on to give the extra information that he was an enthusiast for the new factories, but the exam board may not necessarily give you that information, so I've taken it out here. So he said that the work of the lively elves seemed to resemble a sport in which habit gave them a pleasing dexterity. As to exhaustion, they showed no trace of it. So this man is just gushing with enthusiasm for these factories. Now, the date of this source is absolutely critical. If this source had been created in 1832, then suddenly what it would be saying about the factory reforms would be far less important. But one of the key measures of the 1833 Factory Act was that it limited the working hours of children and mandated that they have a 1.5 hour break. So because this is after 1833, this source strongly implies that this act has helped children maintain energy and even maintain happiness. He also says, I never saw a single instance of corporal punishment. And if you're not sure what corporal punishment is, that's any sort of physical correcting. So hitting someone or like slapping them or anything like that. Now, if you think to the conditions of the 1833 Act and the 1844 Act, there is nothing in there which says that corporal punishment should be banned. We're in a period where hitting your child or hitting a child is seen as a good thing. Even in the Bible, he who spares the rod spoileth the child. It's seen as a good idea to hit your children to keep them in line. And he's saying here that I never saw a single instance of corporal punishment. Now, I know those two things might not seem to go together, but the idea is you should hit your children to keep them in line, but bad, evil employers shouldn't be able to hit their children because they would be doing it out of malice rather than trying to keep the child from going to hell. But Andrew here is saying, I never saw a single instance of corporal punishment. In other words, he never once saw a child be hit by someone who wasn't their parents, which is obviously a really, really good thing, especially for our modern ears. In terms of the first underlined part of the source, he's saying he saw many factories in Manchester and the surrounding districts. Now that contrasts with source C, I believe, Charles Greville, who is giving an account of one factory which he saw. So combined with the fact that this is an expert in manufacturing conditions, you would argue that this is a strongly authoritative source. In other words, Andrew is well informed about factory conditions. He's an expert in it, he knows a lot, and he's been to many of them. However, given that he is clearly an enthusiast about the factory conditions, even the exaggeration of lively elves and all these sorts of things, it's probably not going to be as reliable as you would want it to be. So this is one which is going a long way to support the statement, but perhaps not as strongly supporting it or as convincingly support it as you might wish. If this was coming from a parliamentary report, where the parliamentary investigator or the officials would be far less likely to exaggerate, then suddenly this source would be an incredibly strong piece of evidence. But coming from a man who is very keenly in favour of the factories and doesn't want them to be strongly restricted, it's less likely to be reliable. Doesn't mean that what he's saying isn't true, but it could be that he's deliberately leaving things out. Or it could be that he is just completely lying because he doesn't want further legislation to be passed. Going on to source B, we have a factory inspector's report from 1836. Now you might remember from 1833 that there are only 4 factory inspectors appointed to inspect every single factory across the United Kingdom, including the very unfortunate Rickards, who was for some reason given control of overseeing around half of them, whereas the other half were overseen by the other 3 factory inspectors. But in any case, after a couple of years, Rickards had to step down and quickly died, apparently from overwork. Now, this isn't from Rickard, unfortunately, because he died the year previously. You're not given the name of this inspector, but it doesn't mean that you can't include the information about Rickard as evidence of how overworked and under-scrutinizing these factory inspectors could be. So this source, as I said, does support both and oppose the statement, although the supporting is perhaps not as clear as it could be. The supporting is the final sentence, or the final second sentence, says, "I would certainly punish it with all the severity of my power." So this does suggest that the 1833 Factory Act is partially successful, because the law is being ignored, but they are being held accountable for it. If this had happened in 1834, if it had just been a passing official somehow going into the factory, he would have no direct power to hold the employer to account. But because of the 1833 Factory Act, suddenly you've got this official, this inspector, who is going into the factory, and therefore he's able to punish it. On the other side, the fact that these laws are being so clearly ignored, there is something which would seem completely exaggerated were it not for the fact that it is from a parliamentary official. It's from a factory inspector. Apparently these boys have been 2 days and a night thus engaged. In other words, they've basically been working 2 days non-stop. And the fact that he's asking different people and getting the same answer reinforces that. So he could be a factory official a factory inspector who has interviewed one boy and heard this and then reported it, and he might just put that down to the boy either exaggerating himself or being misunderstood. But the fact that he's going to many different boys here and getting the same answer reinforces the reliability of this. And again, that first sentence, "I took the evidence from the mouths of the boys themselves." There's no danger of, for example, the parents misleading the boys or telling them to lie or hearing it secondhand from someone who heard about it in a pub or anything like that. So all of this is going down to the idea that this is a reliable source. It's clearly authoritative because this is from one of the factory inspectors, and it seems to be relatively representative. It seems representative, in other words, it speaks for many different factories. Now, this does only talk about one factory, Taylor, Ibbotson and Co. But the fact that this has been mentioned in parliamentary papers would suggest that it's important enough for it to make it into the report. Now that means that you've got a massive conflict already between source A and source B, because Andrew in source A is saying that I've visited loads of different factories, never seen anything to cause any concern. Whereas in source B, a factory inspector, a government official, has said entirely the opposite thing. Going on to source C, we have Charles Greville again. And remember, Charles Greville was a political commentator. He was a diarist whose journals were published and they became incredibly important, incredibly popular for the public to kind of digest. Greville was seen as a really, really good diarist because he didn't just comment on public life. He's someone who had access to and knowledge of like the inner workings of government simply because he was a very connected person. But more importantly, he's never been seen as being too far with any sort of aim or goal or party or individual. In other words, he's seen as relatively impartial. He calls them as he sees them and all those sorts of things. So Charles Greville goes to one of the great cotton manufactories, in other words, cotton mills or factories, and he says the infant school was admirably managed, and the recreation ground of the working hands, which was a recent establishment, meant that they could play cricket and football. Now, both of those things are vaguely referenced in the 1833 Factory Act. So this is the idea that each child must have education of some kind and each child must be allowed break times. Now, the fact that this is recently established, or the recreation ground is recently established, does give you some pause for thought. You have no idea when this factory was created, but if this is one of the great cotton manufactories, this has surely been at least several years, if not several decades old, and the recreation ground has only been made in the last couple of years. Looking at when this source was made, it's the only of the four sources which is made after the 1844 Factory Act. So you could potentially argue that maybe the 1833 Factory Act wasn't being followed too strongly until after the 1844 Factory Act. In terms of this great cotton manufactory, there are 1,200 employed there. Now, this gives you a fairly good idea as to what might be happening in the big factories, the truly massive ones. Andrew and the factory inspector don't give any indication as to how big the factories they went into were, but from this source, source C, you would suggest, or you would infer, that the big factories were perhaps more likely to follow the rules. One important thing about both of the Factory Acts, in fact any of the Factory Acts we cover in our course, is that they don't apply to workshops. A workshop is literally one room, could be a relatively large room, in which people are working. Whereas a factory is what we would normally consider a factory, a massive building, maybe many floors, powered by loads of different things, and massive outputs. The workshops are where many, many, many working families worked, especially the young children, and none of those Factory Acts applied to those workshops. So in this source, we have evidence that the greatest or the biggest factories seem to be following at least some of the regulations, but you know from your own knowledge that the factory reforms weren't always successful because this is not describing the way in which most working families worked in textile manufacturing. Going on to the other hand, into the examples of factory reform not being successful, in the hot factory rooms they look very dirty and very miserable. And again we've got the same point with the corporal punishment from source A. There is nothing in the Factory Acts which specifically talks about either the temperature or the cleanliness or the hygiene of these places. So it's not successful in the sense of it's not truly helping working conditions, or at least not massively helping working conditions. It's only restricting, for example, the amount of hours you're allowed to work, but the room's going to be hot no matter what because the factory owners are working in shifts, or they're making the employees work in shifts. They want these factories working as many hours a day as possible, ideally 24 hours a day in some cases. The final bit we're going to talk about is the moral danger. The idea here is that especially girls, but also boys, will be in danger of being abused in some way. So it could be just simple physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, or it could be the basic idea of taking these children away from their parents who are supposed to be guiding them in life, and therefore they're going to become wayward, they're going to become criminals or any sorts of things here. And again, the Factory Acts do nothing to specifically stop that. We've got that point we mentioned before underneath the red bit. The parents make them go because they earn money which they bring home. And annoyingly, you can no longer use that as own knowledge. So that would be own knowledge if it wasn't mentioned anywhere in the four sources. But because it's mentioned in one of them, you can't then use it in relation to source A or source B and have it count as own knowledge. You can certainly compare the sources in that way. The fact that Charles Greville is impartial or seen as impartial and he's presenting both positives and negatives, all of that combined is a really good point to make. But if you came into the exam thinking, I've got to remember about the parents wanting the children to work, and then you see it in the source, it no longer counts, unfortunately. Finally, we've got source D, and this is from Lord Ashley, who you might remember is one of the champions of the 10-hour movement, along with people like Osler. A really small note, Lord Ashley will later go on to become the Earl of Shaftesbury once his dad dies. Lord Ashley being one of those courtesy titles, a weird hang-up from the 1800s. So if you ever saw a source which talks about the Earl of Shaftesbury, it's going to be this guy here. It's not going to be his father. So Lord Ashley is giving a speech in the House of Commons because he's not a real lord, not yet anyway. So as I said before, this is one of the sources which is the most strongly against the statement. To be honest, it's not a massively useful source. It's got really good information, but it kind of just repeats it again and again and again. The gist is 10 hours is the utmost quantity of labour which can be endured by the children. In other words, he's of the opinion, backed up by medical experts, that the 10-hour movement must achieve its goals, otherwise children's health will be harmed. And as we've said before, that is not granted for all people until the 1853 Factory Act. The 1847 Factory Act is the one in which women and children were given their ability to only work 10 hours a day. So, going on to the actual essay technique. So we're going to go over more specific instructions. I'll give you an example of the first part of the first paragraph, and it's up to you guys to make sure that you can complete this as much as possible. Now remember, you have to mention each of the sources at least once. And because the exam board is so generous to you, they'll make sure that 2 sources are clearly for and 2 sources are clearly against. But because they're also trying to test the higher ability students, they're going to try and make sure that 2 of the sources do both. Sometimes they might have 4 sources which agree and 3 sources which disagree, just to really see how well you can do a line-by-line reading. But the point is, for each source, there needs a basic amount of analysis. You need a comment on the content, so that is a direct quote and in your own words, or if it's a picture, it is a direct comment and then a description of the source. You should always start with the content because you don't know how important the provenance is until you're looking at specific examples from the quotes. So you're looking at content, then you're looking at nature or origin or purpose, what we might collectively call the provenance, and you're looking at own knowledge. It doesn't matter which way round you use that, so you could start with the own knowledge and then look at nature, origin, purpose, or you could look at nature, origin, purpose, and then own knowledge. But the gold standard at A level is combining those two. So rather than just, here's a quote about the 1833 Factory Act, I know that you had to have breaks which were 1.5 hours, and then this is a diary or something like that, using the own knowledge to situate it within its historical context. That's what the exam question is specifically asking. Can you understand why these sources are saying this in the moment that they said it, or why the person that said it is saying it in the moment that they said it? So using the own knowledge to scrutinize the nature, origin, purpose, that's what's going to separate the C grades from the B grades, or the B grades from the A grades. So you've got 2 paragraphs, one for the agreeing, one for the disagreeing. Ideally, you can try to group the sources into themes. So if you go back over the last 10 minutes or so and think, in what ways are they collectively talking about working hours, or the abuse or the conditions, or the law being respected or ignored? And at that point, if you put those literally next to each other in the paragraph, so it might be that you've got a small point from source C which you want to add, but if you put that above the first source so that they're combined in the same theme, so for example on the abuse that people suffered, that's going to be a much better way of analysing the sources because you're comparing them within the paragraphs. Finally, in your conclusion, it's at minimum 5 sentences long. The first sentence directly answers the question, so taken as a whole, how far do the sources agree with the statement? So they could slightly agree, they could largely disagree. As a practice, you might want to give each source a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being completely agree, 1 being completely disagree, and then kind of like add it up and see where you get. After that first sentence, each of the 4 sources has to be evaluated in turn, and you're looking for 2 different things for each source. How far do they support it or oppose it? So, for example, source A clearly supports the statement. It strongly supports the idea that factory reform was successful. But it doesn't massively do it in a convincing way because Andrew is clearly gushing with enthusiasm about the factories. His account and his testimony is not as reliable as either source B or source C. On the other hand, Lord Ashley is someone who is incredibly supportive of the 10-hour movement. He's one of the leaders of it. He consistently attacks the Factory Act as not going too far. That doesn't mean that everything he said is now unreliable. He's consulting medical opinions, he's consulting medical experts, he gives example after example where they say 10 hours is the utmost maximum, so you can't just instantly assume that because they want one thing, everything they say in support of that idea is unreliable. You've got to use common sense here. Someone who wants money, money, money is going to be much less reliable than someone who wants to protect children's health and their lives. So you go through each of the sources in turn, giving an idea of how far and how strongly they support the statement, and then if you have time at the end, you might just want one final sentence summing it all up and drawing it all together. So, going to finish here with the first part of the first paragraph, which is pulled together everything we've said here. So you've got the purple phrases, which are the key phrases you should be using. Again, it's starting with the content, and then it's situating the nature, origin, purpose within your own knowledge. Was writing after the 1833 Factory Act, which meant that blah de blah de blah. In other words, not just I know the 1833 Factory Act did this. Is someone who supported the factory, so that blah 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 blah. And then towards the end, you've got source C partially agrees that children had at least the opportunity for activities. In other words, you are comparing, you're grouping source A and source C thematically. As I said before, source C is a really small point, but you're not going to tack that on at the end of the paragraph because source C's point agrees with the main point of source A. So it's a big part on source A, a small comment on source C, you'll analyse source C more thoroughly in the other paragraph, and then you add the full point on source B, and then you'll probably go into the next paragraph, the disagree section. So that's everything on how these sources either support or oppose the view that factory reform was successful. Please let your teacher know if you want any more advice.